What does childbirth feel like? Not sure if this is NSFW.
Worst cramps of your life. Times 1,000, maybe not 1,000, but a lot. The birth itself I honestly can't remember. That part was sweet relief after labor.
Like out a watermelon. It's a question that can't really be answered in any meaningful way. How do you describe what anything feels like? What does eating a pizza feel like, for instance? Childbirth is a uniquely individual experience for every person that goes through it.
For me it was really easy. Being pregnant was the hard part. Giving birth I went to the hospital at 6 p.m. to be induced and she was born at 10:01 the next morning. I woke up at like 6 a.m. and they asked if I wanted my epidural. I said yes, but I wasn't in really any pain, just some mild cramping. Then I ate breakfast and sat with a peanut ball between my legs until the nurse said it was time to push, and then pushed for 3 pushes and it felt kinda slimy, but she was here.
The worst pain you could imagine while trying to out something that's so big it rips you.
The worst contractions, at their peak, with a very large baby, felt like I was being stabbed internally, like knives running down. The worst crowning felt like I was trying to push out something way too big for the opening and I was tearing open to do it, but that was an emergency so there was no waiting in. The mental aspect as well that adds to it, your baby's life, your health, the potential consequences, tearing, stitches. A lot of things are on your mind at the same time. Combine that with multiple days of labor and not sleeping.
Not bad really. Cramps. Then epidural. After the epidural you don't feel anything. I found the 9 months prior worse than the birth.
Labor was like the worst cramps you could ever imagine. Birth was like being split in two. But it was totally worth it.
The head is like growing a third leg very abruptly. After the shoulders emerge it all just kind of blubs out in a rush of changing shape and wetness. I remember thinking it felt like a big slithery octopus. It isn't something you experience many times in your life, so I always suggest being fully aware of it all. It's powerful and exciting to be able to birth a child. I have 5 children, the middle 3 were born at home. No medication with any of the 5.
Contractions feel like really bad muscle cramps. Like you've torn a muscle, kind of muscle cramps. But the pain radiates and doesn't go away for hours. I've heard people describe it like someone put you in a vice grip and kept upping the pressure, and that's fitting too. I have endo and have definitely had periods that were as painful as labor, but they feel different somehow. I honestly was surprised more by how intensely emotional labor is more than anything else. And I cannot recommend getting in a tub of hot water enough.
I agree. The contractions were so much worse than the actual birthing. Although I must add I had an average-sized baby that took his time but was in the right position and didn't get stuck. I can imagine the baby being stuck would be more painful.
Caesar mum could feel the surgeon rummaging around inside my stomach. It felt like being on a roller coaster. Then the tugging as they yanked her out. It was gross.
Apparently I screamed. I'm ripping. Feels like a watermelon is ripping your ass open, I'd say. I say apparently because I really can't remember much. No drugs but just a haze. And I immediately felt amazing after. Those after baby hormones are amazing. I did it 3 times without pain relief, so I guess it was okay.
It's so overwhelming. It's so bodily and primal, it feels like an out-of-body experience that our mere human minds can't handle. It's an act not made for sentience. It's incomprehensible and not something to be understood unless it's currently being experienced.
It makes a huge difference if you have an epidural. You only feel intense pressure and not pain. With no worst cramps of your life that make you want to die. And the birthing is literally like being ripped open. Such terrible pain that makes you think you're dying on the birthing bed.
I used very little medication with my last 2 labors, so I'll go into a bit of detail. Starts off like a period. Gets mentally exhausting more than anything as your body is made to do this. It's all in the mind like anything in life. Contractions can be misleading for days. Frustratingly, very intense to very little pain at times. When you're pushing it's like the worst poo of your life, bit burny too. If you've not given birth, my best advice is to practice your pelvic floors and please practice holding it. As that kind of is what's needed when you're pushing and you head the midwife's shout stop between contractions and you're pushing. If you don't hold it, baby goes back up the birthing canal and your next push is just as lengthily as the previous. I found with my last I somehow held him there and got him out in a few minutes from this weird analogy in my head I created and have shared with yous. It doesn't hurt when pushing either. You get used to the pain level, it's just tiring because you know you're at the end. Woman shrugging, medium skin tone, tears of joy.
Like you're being stabbed in your ass over and over but you just won't die.
Not the person you're asking, but no, you really don't feel any pain at all. I thought the people that said they could take a nap after they got their epidurals were lying or exaggerating, but I literally slept through the majority of my labor after the epidural.
I hated it. I felt entirely out of control. When active labor started and the pain was already incredibly bad, and I knew I very likely had at least 5 to 6 H of worsening pain ahead of me, I panicked completely. For me, I felt the pain in my stomach but pulling into my thighs and back. From that point onwards I also didn't get breaks between contractions anymore. It was just non-stop. I remember watching the CTG just praying for it to go down, but each time one contraction had barely passed its peak another one was starting. They ended up giving me something to slow down my contractions so they could even attempt to place an epidural, but that stalled the labor too much, so they gave me something to speed them back up and turned to epidural off. I was in no state to understand or decide anything and felt like decisions were just being made for me, without having the capacity to do or even really think about it. My husband and I were also entirely alone until I was crowning. The midwife just quickly rushed in, said I was 10 centimeters, instructed my husband to hold my leg and told me to push, and left again. I ended up having to push from 12:30 a.m. to 4:06 a.m. I was so exhausted. I don't know if something happened, but the OB that eventually came said that either I get him out now or she'll have to cut. Then the midwife started pushing on my stomach while the OB pulled from below. It was horrendously painful, completely out of control and terrifying. I remember begging them to stop, but they wouldn't. Then he was finally out. I got to hold him for a few minutes, then he got checked by the midwife and the OB got to sewing, yelling at me to stop clenching when I had zero muscle control or even feeling for what the anything was doing down, still deciding if we even want a second child, but if we do, there's no way in I'm doing that again. I'll get a scheduled C-section. I know healing from that is probably going to more than from a vaginal birth, but I'm never going through that again.
I would also say that labor has phases. Even though mine were without any pause between the cramps. At first the cramps are lighter, and they take your focus. But then they ramp up so much that focus is not a thing anymore and the cramps become your whole reality. Visual field shrinks to near or complete zero, as does any thought, emotion, sound, etc. Nothing matters because there's nothing beside labor that exists. Comes the pushing stage, which opens up a little more space for pure existence again. Thoughts, emotions can return, don't always do. Your body will push, even if you don't tell it to. It will overrule anything. It feels like your body isn't yours anymore, while simultaneously being more you than ever before in a very animal way. There's a big split between body and on it being first labor or not. This part goes different, I think. First labor is more coherent, births after a more body can feel something huge being pushed forward and slipping back. That might seem like it's not making progress, but it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You can feel the extra step forward because it hurts. There's a moment where there's no step backwards anymore. This is the ring of fire. In my experience, this is worst the first labor. Everything is stretched over the max point and needs to get used to that before it proceeds. If you push, then you tear. So try to stop that. This is _hard _. Then comes the birth itself, which feels weirdly fast, wet and warm, slippery, big. It's a unique feeling. I don't quite know how to describe it. It feels important too, in a strange primal way. And it feels like an incredible relief. Everything from before melts away to comes the breastfeeding, after birth, contractions and bleeding for weeks to get your back to regular size, emotional rollercoasters in getting to know a person who cannot communicate while being 100% depending on you for survival. Learning a new skill, breastfeeding, under huge pressure because your baby dies if it isn't fed. While healing. So fun. I'd love to do it once more, because of how insanely special it all is, but I can't handle another pregnancy.